Again, if you were just joining us moments ago, we are speaking today about Oregon's dirty secret, PERS, PFAS, and fossil fuel lobbyists. My name's Aiden. I'm the Oregon director of F-, and I will be moderating today. And before we jump in, I want to acknowledge the land we are meeting on. I know we're in many different locations and are joining this meeting from many different cities, but most of us are on the traditional territories of the Kalapuya, the Multnomah, the Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, and bands of Chinook, Tualatin, and Molalla people across the state. And we honor the ways they've cared for this land for generations. I also want to note we will be recording this session. Live captions are enabled. Please treat the chat and Q&A respectfully. We'd like to hear everyone's voice. And if you see anything that makes you uncomfortable in the chat, please just flag it for a moderator. Please also feel free to share any questions throughout. For our panelists today, I'd like to have each of you introduce yourselves, where you're from, and the organization that you belong to. So perhaps we could start today with Jennifer.
Jennifer Schramm. I'm co-lead with Sue Palmater of Divest Oregon, which is a statewide organization.
Awesome. And we'll hear more from Jennifer later. Mason, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, so happy to be here. My name is Mason Levitt, and I am a research analyst at Beyond Toxics based in Eugene, Oregon.
Thanks, Mason. We will also be hearing from Mason later. And lastly, we will be hearing from our executive director at F-, James Browning. Would you like to introduce yourself as well, James?
Hi, everyone. James, I'm the founder and director of F-, and I'm based in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia.
Awesome. So thank you to all our panelists. Today, we're going to be walking through how the same hired gun contract lobbying firms are working both inside and outside our public institutions, how that impacts everything from youth health through harmful chemicals like PFAS or forever chemicals, how our public pension fund is entangled in fossil fuel investments, and what we can do about it. So we'll start with a brief agenda. First, we'll give you the high-level framing and why this matters for families, for all of us in Oregon. Then we'll dive into two key case studies, PFAS, again, forever chemicals, and PERS, the Public Employee Retirement System in Oregon, and lobbyist conflicts relating to both of those issues. After that, we'll have a lightning round of shared lobbyist examples, kind of key conflicts of interest, worst hits, you might say, showing how the structures overlap. And then we'll wrap with a question and answer portion. Again, please feel free to include your questions in the chat. And then we'll share some concrete action steps that you can take starting today. And at the end of the hour, you'll have ways to act, join a growing community, parents, retirees, organizers, folks like us, and help us shift where money and power is going. So without further ado, we'll get started, and James will talk about the framing for this issue.
Thanks, Aiden. It's really, it's great to be here with everyone. I did get a couple comments that folks were having trouble hearing me. Is this okay on the audio? Just let me know in the chat. So I grew up in Portland, and my family moved away when I was young. And I think I never recovered from the shock. There's nowhere like it. When we launched F-, a couple of years ago, that came out of work I had actually done a long time ago as an anti-tobacco lobbyist. This was my first lobbying job. It was in Maryland. It was for the American Cancer Society. And the debate back then was over having smoking in bars and restaurants. And I worked with a very good lobbyist for the American Lung Association. And after a year or so, I noticed that he did a lot of work for another client, which was the Maryland Automobile Dealers Association. And when he wasn't fighting for smoke-free bars and restaurants, he was fighting against stronger emissions regulations for cars. And I finally asked him, isn't this a conflict? And he said, no, it's fine because cigarettes are indoor air and cars are outdoor air. And that really stuck with me. And at the time, I tried to take a list of conflicts like that to the Washington Post and other media outlets. And the response I got was, well, you can't really expect us to police every single one of these lobbyists. And how do we know how bad the problem is? So much later, with some wonderful friends and colleagues, we were able to make a couple years ago a list of every single oil and gas and coal lobbyist in the country and all of their other clients. And we have tagged all of their other clients by sector. And you can use this list to start to tell the story of how these fossil fuel lobbying firms are harming their own clients. And whenever you have a minute to look through this, you will see that they also represent hundreds of conservation groups and healthcare groups who are fighting cancer and other diseases caused by exposure to fossil fuels. They represent local governments facing staggering climate mitigation costs. They even represent philanthropies who fund climate groups. So there is a deep problem here, and it has gone overlooked for a long time. And one of the most exciting things since we launched F- has been connecting with great storytellers about the climate crisis in places like Oregon and California. And what we are finding is combining this idea and this data with powerful storytelling. It matters, and it can disrupt this dynamic and pressure people to cut ties with these fossil fuel lobbyists. So just to share an example from California, we did a study last year of universities who are advocating for climate bills, they're doing climate research, but then in some cases they're being undermined by their own lobbyists. And so maybe you've seen some of the research around the health impacts of gas stoves. Stanford did a couple of studies showing that exposure to chemicals from gas stoves can be the equivalent of secondhand smoke exposure. And so that study, that's really like an incredibly important opening in the climate fight, because we have more and more proof that fossil fuels are carcinogenic at every stage of their life cycle. When extracting them, people living next to those extraction sites are exposed to carcinogens, pipelines, and in the end use of gas as well. So this research inspired a bill in California to put health warning labels on gas stoves, and it passed the assembly. And as is often the case with climate leading states like California and Oregon, this could be a model for the whole country. But something happened, and that something was that Stanford's own lobbying firm also represents gas companies opposed to this bill, and they got to the governor in California and he vetoed it. So that is what can happen. And it is easy to tell this story in states with strong disclosure, where you can see the bills that lobbyists are lobbying on, the positions they take on the bills, how much they are paid. It is much harder to tell in states like Oregon, because it has a very weak lobbyist disclosure system that lets lobbyists operate with really an extraordinary degree of secrecy. And that secrecy is going to explain some of the conflicts that I'll show you later after we hear from Mason and Jennifer.
Thank you, James, so much for that context. As James was noting, fossil fuels and their petrochemical derivatives are really serious carcinogens. And a group that many of you may already be really familiar with, Beyond Toxics, is one of our leading champions for environmental justice in Oregon. And much of their work centers on chemicals like certainly petrochemicals and PFAS as well, as a major threat to health and well-being of communities across the state. So I will invite Mason to tell us a little bit more about Beyond Toxics and their work.
Well, funnily enough, my first project at Beyond Toxics was at gas stoves and about gas stoves, and we did a study on that. And funnily enough, I'm not here talking about that today, but y'all should check that out at another point if you're interested. We have a great video on it. But hi, my name is Mason Levitt. I am a research analyst at Beyond Toxics, and my work has primarily been in and around methane and the toxics that are connected to that. So I worked on gas stoves for a while Eugene was having its own campaign. And most recently, over the last 2 years, I've been working in and around landfills, particularly Coffin Butte landfill north of Corvallis. And there's a lot of methane in that gas, but there's also a lot of PFAS. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today and the importance of those things. PFAS, or forever chemicals, I'm sure many of us have heard about, are everywhere. One of my favorite questions I got to ask while preparing for this, among other things, was, where are they located in our consumer products? And it's often, I actually think it would have been easier to ask, where are PFAS not located in our consumer products? So this list in front of you all is by no means comprehensive. But generally, I think you can ask the question, is this product adhesive? Is it water resistant? Is it fire resistant? Is it stain resistant? Is it grease resistant? And if your answer to any of those questions are yes, then I think we're likely in a situation where PFAS or forever chemicals are likely to be in them. This is a name for a group of chemicals. Not all PFAS are the same. Not all of them have the same properties, and not all of them have the same health impacts. But we generally talk about them as a collective because they share a common chemical structure. They're in building materials. Again, are those water resistant? Are they fire resistant? Okay, well, then they're likely in the building material. They're also in cosmetics and many of the plastics that we use every day, and they leach out in that process. I know they're in contact lenses. This has come up in a conversation with my partner multiple times, who puts those in his eyes every day. And these are really consequential because they're linked to kidney harm, testicular cancer, kidney cancer, thyroid issues. They harm our immune systems, and they're particularly harmful for children where they cause neurological damage and are likely to manifest in continued health impacts throughout their lives. And they're everywhere. Again, a lot easier to say where they aren't. There are a lot of methods of exposure to PFAS. You can absorb them through your skin. For example, if you're skidding on AstroTurf all the time, there's been a lot of research showing that you absorb a lot of PFAS through artificial turf. They're in personal care products, which you also apply to your skin. And it can occur through swimming in particularly leachate contaminated waters, which I'll talk a tiny bit more about. They're also prevalent through a lot of industrial operations, prominently through manufacturing and application of PFAS to materials, but also landfills, which is how I have spent a lot of time in and around this question. Landfills have two byproducts that PFAS can escape through. One is landfill gas, which is a huge climate concern, but also for local air quality and health, it's a huge public health concern. You can breathe in a lot as they escape through the landfill gas, whether it be through leaks in the facility or through emissions from a stack flare. They also escape by way of leachate, which is the liquid byproduct that comes out of landfills, particularly located in wet environments. If a landfill is located west of the Cascades here in Oregon, it generates several million gallons of leachate a year, which are highly, 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 highly concentrated in PFAS. That leachate is sent to a municipal wastewater treatment plant, and that treatment plant has no technology to treat these toxins. And so it effectively gets dumped into the Willamette River or some of its tributaries, which means that we're then exposed to that through swimming in the Willamette, for those of us who dare, or drinking water. And this map kind of shows that relationship where landfills generate that leachate, where they ship it to for disposal, and how that is upstream of drinking water intake for many Oregonians. So their landfills, given PFA's predominant concentration in consumer products, they all end up in landfills at some point. And so I think it's really helpful to think about landfills as a sink where all PFAs, theoretically eventually go, at least for now. And that's why we've taken a particular concern to them as it relates to communities located near them. And we've done a lot of work in and around that. But if we go to the next slide, this isn't the only, oh, I guess I'll say one last thing here that's worth harping on just a little bit more, is also bioaccumulation. So PFAs, when they end up, for example, in the Willamette River, fish then eat food in there, they absorb it through, breathing through their gills, and it accumulates in their muscle tissue, and then we eat those fish, and the PFAs get to us through that way. It's also worth mentioning that sewage treatment plants also produce a large amount of biosolids, and those biosolids are often spread on fields, particularly for feeding cattle. And then cattle eat the PFA contaminated plants. It accumulates in the cattle. We then eat the cattle, and then it gets to us. And there have been several farms shut down in Maine, for example, due to PFAS contamination. And that is an illegal practice in a couple of states, and unfortunately not yet in Oregon. So that brings us to the next slide, which is that managing this toxic requires both upstream thinking and downstream thinking. Oregon Environmental Council has done a lot of good work in leading upstream solutions, right? The idea is we don't have to deal with the consequences of this toxic material in our homes, in our buildings, in our rivers, in our farmlands, if we just don't produce it to begin with, right? So shutting down that tap makes it so that we're not managing as much PFAS. But then there's also a downstream problem, as I've articulated here, right? So even if we were to turn off the tap tomorrow, we still need to be thinking about managing all of the PFAs that have accumulated everywhere, and particularly in landfills. So how do we begin to capture and destroy those, or store them away forever? I put that in brackets. Had enough time with thinking about throwing away in landfills to know it doesn't go away. But how do we put that and manage it in a safe environment? And those require policy solutions and policy thinking. And that brings us back to the whole point of this webinar, which is, how can we effectively generate policy solutions, with lobbyists working to persuade those legislators if they are double dipping and have an inherent conflict of interest in their work. And so with that, I will pass it back off.
Thank you so much, Mason, for that dispiriting but illuminating treatment of just how pervasive PFAS are in our environment and how many ways we come into contact with them. Another angle we see for this issue is our institutions, not just as failing to protect us from environmental and health threats, but as active investors and participants in generating further fossil fuel infrastructure, fossil fuel expansion, and putting public dollars towards fossil fuels. And Divest Oregon, which again, many of you may already know about their work, has been a leading advocate to encourage our public employee retirement system to stop making investments in fossil fuels and be more transparent and forthright on the way. So with that, Jennifer, if you'd like to tell us a bit about your role in Divest Oregon's work and what brings you to this issue as well.
Sure. Sue Palmer and I started Divest Oregon in 2021. We wanted to follow the money and find out where there were real sinks of investment in fossil fuels. And the Oregon State Treasury controlled $140 billion. And so we decided that that was our target. And here we are. So Divest Oregon is an organization of volunteers. And I've been asked to talk about Divest Oregon's work and about our contact with a featured lobbyist. So do you want me to go ahead and start that story now, Aiden?
That'd be great.
Okay. If you can move to the next slide. Divest Oregon is a grassroots coalition of over 100 organizations. F- is a member, Beyond Toxics is a member, and we also include labor unions, faith communities, racial and climate justice groups, and so on. Divest Oregon calls on the Oregon State Treasury to shift from funding climate destruction to investing in a sustainable future. And as I said, we chose the Treasury because they manage $100 billion in state employee retirement benefits in the PERS fund. That's part of their bigger budget. Today we're talking about lobbying, and Divest Oregon has run 4 bills in 4 years. Next slide, please. Oregon PERS Retirees Inc., known as OPRI, showed up when we ran our second bill, which called for full divestment from fossil fuels. And the bill failed, but it precipitated a Treasury net zero plan we're now pressuring the Treasury to strengthen. The Treasurer opposed the bill. OPRI testified against this bill. And OPRI claimed that they represented PERS members. They cited a survey of 546 PERS members opposing the bill. And the survey questionnaire stated the bill would lead to lower returns. So that tended to bias the outcome. The Coal Act divested PERS from thermal coal holdings, but was primarily important in establishing a precedent of legislative oversight of the Treasury. There was no OPRI testimony against that bill. We negotiated the language with the Treasurer, and it passed. The 2025 PAWS Act put pressure on the Treasury to impose a moratorium on new investment in private equity funds or private investment generally, holding fossil fuel assets. It did not pass, the Treasurer opposed it, and OPRI testified against it, saying a membership poll of their 10,000 members showed 60% opposed it. And the poll wasn't included in their testimony, but their letter of testimony said members perceived a risk to fund returns. Divest Oregon supported the Treasurer's 2025 Climate Resilience Investment Act, which is known as CREA, after gaining inclusion of a just transition provision. And a couple months ago, we convened national groups who are also meeting with the Oregon Treasury. We're looking for common ground to suggest clean energy transition policies, and that would include a limitation on new investment in private equity funds supporting the fossil fuel industry. And that's a fascinating and positive ongoing discussion with those other groups working on this issue. Next slide, please. And then just bigger picture of what Divest Oregon is up to. We are building on our current reports that we released in 2025. The Climate Risk Review synthesizes climate, economic, and investment research. The research shows that protecting portfolio asset values from sources of substantial climate risk is a financial decision that's part of a fund manager's duty. It calls out the obligation to manage the fund to protect young future beneficiaries as well as current retirees. Just Transition and the Oregon Treasury explores efforts to define and advance a just transition to clean energy. The report's work on Indigenous peoples' rights and labor rights has opened the door to ongoing work with local and national organizations. To choose investments that support a just transition goal and support our demand to end fossil fuel investment, the Treasury has to have an effective screening process for investments, which brings us to Oregon Treasury's Investment Screening Failures Report. It profiles Oregon's fossil fuel investments that worsen the climate crisis, violate people's rights, cause injury to communities, and cause financial harm to PERS holdings. The report uses Treasury's investments in spyware and immigrant detention contractors with a history of human rights abuse to show the lack of screening by the Treasury of their investments, public and private. The reports support each other, and each report suggests specific actions by the Treasury to protect the PERS portfolio. Next slide, please. There's been significant recent media coverage, thank you, Alex, in Oregon of the deficiencies of Treasury's investment practices. Our website, divestoregon.org, has an update section that covers the media attention and our response. The website's an easy and excellent way to track our progress in advancing our members' demands to end investment in fossil fuels, invest in a just, climate-safe future, and get the Treasury to reveal their investments and their investment process to fund beneficiaries and to the public. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that eye-opening treatment. I'm always surprised at just how large the numbers are when you are investing the billions that we will pay out to former public employees. Now, James is going to talk a little bit about the actual regulatory landscape in Oregon and how the severe conflicts of interest we see across the state, across industries, are able to persist.
Thanks, Aidan. So go to the next slide, please. So let's start by talking about some of the conflicts around forever chemicals and some of the interests who helped block a bill this year, House Bill 3512, to ban them in some consumer products. Now, Oregon's lobbying law, it only offers a very dim window into what these lobbyists are doing, but thanks to some great climate reporters in the state and thanks to our team of researchers, we were able to connect a lot of the interests to this bill, and it tells a pretty incredible story. So here are clients of Miller Public Affairs, and this firm actually more than any other firm in our entire list of hundreds of firms in the country wins, I think, the I can't believe this is happening award because, I mentioned before that I was an anti-tobacco lobbyist. That was for the American Cancer Society, and they once told me that they had a policy of never hiring tobacco lobbyists. I've since tried to push them and make the case that a lot of their lobbying firms are pushing fossil fuel projects that also give people cancer. We're not there yet, but here it is. Here is a firm lobbying for the American Cancer Society, Willamette Valley Cancer Institute, and also Altria. So that's just tobacco. Northwest Grocery Association is here because they testified against the Forever Chemicals bill this year. And their lobbyists made the case that this was overreach for Oregon, that Oregon should just rely on federal regulations and federal testing to solve the problem. But of course, one big problem with that argument is that the federal government is going full speed backwards on this issue right now, both from a policy perspective and if you look at all of the DOGE cuts to environmental protection and health programs, one effect of those cuts is to leave a lot more people exposed to PFAS, to shut down a lot of the studies about their dangers. And as you may have seen, the real leader on this issue nationally, the American Chemistry Council, has now endorsed the idea of federal preemption of all state forever chemicals regulations, wiping them all out. So, so here is a firm, it's not just that they're lobbying for cancer treatment and tobacco. It's not just that they're lobbying against a forever chemicals ban, and they're lobbying for these clients who are affected by forever chemicals, the cancer groups and the Coastal Conservation Association, whose chapter in another state, New Hampshire, does a lot of testing for forever chemicals in the state's waterways. But they're also lobbying for Pacific Corp, which is a company that runs coal-fired power plants, exposing people to carcinogens. They've been held liable for forest fires in the West, which have exposed people to carcinogenic smoke. And if you've ever seen the gunk that collects around the base of telephone poles, that's them also, and that stuff is also carcinogenic, and they're in trouble for that gunk in California. So, why hasn't this story been told before? Again, part of it is that it's hard to connect the dots in Oregon because we don't have disclosure of bills lobbied upon and positions taken on these bills. But the other piece of this, and anyone who's spent time in Oregon's capital, other capital, knows, it's one thing to have our diagram here spattered with oil, but when you meet these people, they are very good at their jobs, and some of them are very charming. I have myself had the experience of sitting next to an oil and gas lobbyist at a hearing for 3 hours and knowing all of the bad things they've done. But by the end of the 3 hours, I'm just sitting there thinking, this guy is wearing the most beautiful pair of shoes I've ever seen, and where do I get a pair of those shoes? And I hope they have them in a size 16. So this is the reality we are up against, which is that the people attached to these causes are deeply ensconced in the legislature, and it's going to take a lot of pressure to disrupt this dynamic. And Jasmine, if we could have the next slide, please. And I think talking about the Kochs and PERS and divestment is important for that. I think Aidan and I are just both so inspired by the work that Divest Oregon has done on moving PERS to a better place and raising this issue and the importance of the way it invests and the tone that sets. And as Jennifer laid out, that list of kind of screening items for the Treasury Department, it's not just fossil fuels. If you look at that list, the Kochs are on the wrong side of a lot of these issues. So when this lobbying firm that claims to speak for PERS, and they're also speaking for the Kochs, if you look at the totality of what the Kochs are doing and how much this firm is getting paid, and the deeper you dig, it is a very Koch-centric agenda, and it's really questionable how much they have the interests of Oregon's public retirees in the forefront. The Kochs, Jasmine is the founder of Unkoch My Campus, which is an incredible organization which sort of like lifted the veil on the extent to which Kochs have funded a lot of major universities and really warped their priorities. And during time I spent at Common Cause, I had a chance to work with a lot of groups on Koch's involvement in the American Legislative Exchange Council. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. This is essentially a bill mill that took some of America's biggest fossil fuel and other corporations and brought them together with sort of corporate-minded legislators, and they would come up with model legislation on things like fracking and keeping fracking chemicals secret, and then they would move out into the states and through the Koch funding network try to get these passed. And so on almost every major issue dealing with climate and public health, the Kochs have been on the other side of this. They have been all about dismantling regulations, stripping people of protections on climate and health. And it's really the precursor for the incredible damage we saw done this year by the Trump administration and DOGE. And just to share another example from California on this, and this relates back to what Oregon lobbying firms are doing. Since the beginning of the year, we have also been tracking lobbyists who work for companies owned by Elon Musk and who stuck with Musk even as DOGE and Trump were profoundly harming their other clients. There's an incredible example of this in Oregon, which is the firm CFM Advocates, which a week before the 2024 election, they signed Tesla as a client. Now, this is a firm that also represents Portland Public Schools, and we would need a whole other call to just start talking about the harm to public education from DOGE and Trump. This Tesla firm, CFM Advocates, also represents Oregon Public Broadcasting, and we've seen the public broadcasting system defunded. They represent the city of Eugene and a range of other clients who are really at the forefront of pushing for better regulations on climate and health, and yet their own firm is sticking with Musk at this time of incredible peril for the climate movement. So if you're interested in this particular campaign, I really recommend our partners Stop the Money Pipeline, and we are working with them on highlighting other firms who have stuck with Musk even as DOGE is harming their own clients. And there's another fascinating pension fund example of this that I wanted to mention, which is in California. The Los Angeles County Public Employees Retirement System has a Musk firm. And if you total up the costs to the city, the economic damage, the social harm, the loss of funding for climate, economic development, social justice, housing, you name it, it is far, far greater than whatever benefits this PERS system in California is going to get out of this firm. Now, this is an awkward question, and I want to be frank about this, right? At this moment of like the dismantling of, I think, a lot of the protections on climate and health and democracy, I think that we all assumed were inviolable and would always be there. Why is F minus? Why are some of these other groups? Why are you calling out, some of the better actors on this? Or, isn't it the fault of the fossil fuel companies? Isn't it the fault of these lobbyists? Yes, absolutely it is. But these other groups have power and potential to do something about this, and that is to divest from these fossil fuel firms, to divest from these forever chemical firms, and it will matter, and it will disrupt this dynamic, and it will be a way of holding them accountable. And I just want to share one last example on this, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Aidan to talk about solutions in Oregon that we're developing to Oregon's disclosure crisis, which is I mentioned 20 years ago, bringing this idea into the Washington Post, and their response was, well, sure, everybody does this, right? You can't expect us to hold every single lobbyist accountable. Well, I think two things have changed since then. And one is that climate impacts are so immediate, and this divestment strategy is working in other sectors. It is working with groups like Clean Creatives, forcing ad agencies and PR firms to drop their fossil fuel clients. It is working as students and faculty and alumni force universities to go fossil free. It is working with groups like Law Students for Climate Accountability, pressuring law firms to drop their fossil fuel clients. So this is an incredibly important part of the movement, but frankly, it only works if it is connected to these things that are happening right now, and that is Divest Oregon's push on PERS. It is Beyond Toxic's push on forever chemicals, and so we are very excited about using this data to tell this story and help everyone get a better outcome on forever chemicals and these other things. So the last example that I wanted to share with you is we just did a report. We decided, why not? We'll do all of Canada, and we worked with Environmental Defense, which is Canada's biggest environmental group, and we made the first ever database. Every federal and provincial fossil fuel lobbyist up there, and much to our surprise, in the process of just talking to these groups and putting out this data, many local governments and a number of prominent health groups fired their fossil fuel lobbying firm, and it was that easy. And it's just because the story had never been told before. Maybe it just needed to be told. It just needed to be told in the right way, and that's why I think we're all so happy to be here with you, and to figure out what those stories are, to break through on this, and to finally hold some of these lobbyists accountable. And so with that, over to you, Aidan.
Thank you, James, for that stirring indictment of the problem, and Canada as a hopeful example of how we can make change by making information more public. But as many of you know, I'm sure many of you are either leaders in your community or leaders of institutions or organizations that advocate for change. Sometimes you need more than just bad press, and particularly for some of the lobbyists who have had their dirty laundry aired before in terms of their conflicts of interest. They may not change their ways without more formal reform. So we have proposed a few solutions that we think would take really square aim at this problem and prevent some of the most galling conflicts of interest and other ethical violations. So requiring regular disclosure of the most important activity that lobbyists do, which is to take positions on pieces of legislation on behalf of their clients. Some of the leaders are sister states like Colorado that have the gold standard of just a few days from taking a position. They have to disclose to the state secretary of state, make it easily available on a state website to see all the positions lobbyists are taking. Is a really critical way of holding them accountable and making sure the public can actually see what major dollars, major donors, and money in politics is accomplishing through lobbyists. Another key reform would be to ban lobbyists from deceiving or intentionally misleading lawmakers. Several states have made this illegal. We think in Oregon, it's not explicit enough that this would be impermissible, and we need to formally make that true so that lobbyists who get a meeting for one client can't drop the misleading or deceptive talking points of another client to that same lawmaker. We also need to treat law firms that lobby the same as all other lobbyists. As James mentioned, Law Students for Climate Accountability is doing important work highlighting just how pervasive the lobbying on behalf of fossil fuel clients is on the part of major law firms. And many try, especially at the state level, to shirk or avoid altogether some of the disclosure requirements they might normally be obligated to obey on the grounds of attorney-client privilege or confidentiality. And we think that needs to be reformed so that when they're doing lobbying activities, that they have the same transparency obligations as others. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, lobbyists should be required to get any existing clients informed written consent before they take on any new clients with adverse interests. We don't want the folks at the American Cancer Society to be totally hoodwinked or never told at all about the fact that their lobbyist is also working for perhaps the most prolific example of big tobacco's excesses and public health harms. So we think that informed consent piece is a powerful barrier to the kinds of ethical violations we still see today in Oregon. So with that, that's the problem, the solution, and now we want to help you understand pieces of it better. So hopefully you have been putting questions that you'd like answered in the chat throughout the call, throughout the webinar. If you haven't already, please feel free to add some now. We will pick through some and direct them to our panelists as appropriate. Jennifer, Mason, and James will all be able to answer pieces of what they spoke about. And if it's challenging for you to type for any reason, please feel free to use the raise hand function, and we can call on people to just say their questions aloud as well. So I will let everyone take a moment to put down any questions you may have.
Aidan, Dan's question looks like a good place to start. Asking, I think for you, who are the leaders for lobbying reform?
Yeah. So exactly who is the tip of the spear on lobbying reform in the legislature changes from session to session in some respects. Over the years, different lawmakers have introduced different proposed reforms. Sometimes Republicans will be concerned about lobbyists immediately after leaving public office and whether they're being compensated in very questionable pay-to-play type situations that peddle former influence. Sometimes leadership on lobbying reform has come from folks who care about the issues that we've highlighted today about PFAS in particular, leaders like Senator Courtney Neron-Mislin, who have highlighted the public health harms of some of these conflicts of interest, whether they thought about it that way or not. So who our champions will be in the next session and the sessions to come remains to be seen. But I think it's heartening that there is a real bipartisan distribution of confidence that this is an issue that needs to be handled differently and that needs to be reformed in ways as dramatic as recent years' campaign finance reform has been, because a lot of lawmakers understand this as an issue of money in politics as well. It's a great question, Dan. Dan's also asking how often Oregon legislators are hired by lobbying firms when they leave the legislature. I don't know the exact frequency of this. I don't think it's particularly common, but a wide range of public employees and officials will sometimes parlay their expertise, having been on the ground in the room where it happens, being policymakers, or at least influencing policymakers, into very lucrative careers as lobbyists shortly after taking advantage of their existing networks. I don't know how often that happens as some kind of percentage rate, but we know it does from time to time. So it's a great question. Bill is asking, the legislature wants you to think they've passed campaign finance reform. They're actually dragging their feet on it. We agree that some of these reforms are not happening perhaps as fast as we'd like, but we think there is real appetite for reforming conflicts of interest and issues of money in politics at the moment. I am perhaps not able to see everyone who is in the meeting, but again, if you also have an easier time just sharing your question, please feel free to raise your hand and we can call on folks to say theirs as well. Karen's asked, corporations will always send lobbyists, but how do we get people or systems that make decisions of what we invest in, presumably to act differently? Do we need to have AI developed that is actively making better decisions, even if the criteria is how much money is made, lost, or spent on health costs and safety costs? I'm not quite sure I understand Karen's question, but my intuition is that we need clearer accountability signals for elected officials, not just for lobbyists who are trying to influence them, but also the people who are in positions of power. We think that resolving
as the parent of two kids, all of whose classmates seem to be using AI, I'm happy to weigh in on this.
Sure, please.
I highly recommend this website in California called Cal Matters, which uses AI to track every single word that is publicly uttered in the California Assembly. And what's so amazing about that is that you can find firms getting paid to lobby for and against the same bills at the same time. And actually, Jasmine, I think this is a really good example. Jasmine, if we could go back to slide number 4, I could just talk about that example for a minute. So in California, there were 2 bills dealing with forever chemicals this last year. And one was a proposed ban in some consumer products, and the other proposed the creation of a cleanup fund to help local water agencies get forever chemicals out of their water. So using this the system, this Cal Matters system that I mentioned, we started looking at the firms on both sides of this issue. And we found, first of all, that a number of firms were lobbying against the ban on forever chemicals in consumer products, but then lobbying for the cleanup fund, right? Which is sort of like a you break it, you get paid to fix it business model. They're guaranteeing the continued supply of the pollutants that they're going to get paid to help these other clients clean up. So that's pretty bad. But then we found that these firms were actually lobbying for and against the ban at the same time on behalf of different clients. And that's where you've arrived at a point where, I mean, these firms, you know, primarily their interest is just making money. You know, why only get paid to work on one side of this issue when you can get paid for both sides and you're not going to get caught? But it is profoundly amoral, and they're really gaming the system. And we can't even see this in most states because the lobbying disclosure systems are so weak. So this is really why it is imperative to right now find out what these lobbyists, the Forever Chemicals lobbyists, the Kochs, people blocking divestment from PERS, we need to know what they are doing right now in Oregon, especially at this moment of peril and backsliding at the federal level.
Thanks, James. We have another great question from the chat that seems like it may have just moved. And this, perhaps Jennifer, you could help answer this. Is anyone from the Treasury itself investigating the interaction between corporate lobbyists and Treasury Department staff, and what incentives or disincentives have been offered to change or ask for reports on investment? Do they answer for bad investments? Do they have standards for not investing besides fiscal outcomes? If the money earned is not good, who gets fired, who is replaced to better represent investors?
Well, the short answer to that is the Oregon Investment Council sets policy for the Treasury, but they actually have no enforcement power. And there's no other oversight of the Treasury to my knowledge. And the Treasury certainly does not disclose that information to my knowledge. They're quite opaque in terms of even just what their private investments are, for example, let alone this other much higher level of information that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, to supplement Jennifer's answer, the primary check or accountability for the Treasury may be the legislature, which has all the challenges one might anticipate from a legislature. I think we have time for one more question, potentially, and then James will have some next steps and action items. Before we get any others, Alex has asked, is there any legislation forthcoming that would require politicians to disclose when they meet with lobbyists, any log that is required to be kept? We have not yet proposed such legislation. I think that would be also a valuable reform to bring accountability to light. Something about getting legislators to regulate themselves more is a bit of a sticky situation and a tricky challenge, but I agree that it could be really effective.
And Aidan, I just want to share I want to be completely candid with everyone on this call about this. So I have worked on this lobbying reform issue in probably, I don't know, 12, 13 states when I was a regional director for Common Cause. And I have been, the director of a small nonprofit also, and I know how difficult it can be to always make sure you're in compliance with lobbying disclosure requirements. But I have many, many times been in conversations with small groups in places like Delaware, trying to make the case that paying, a $50 registration fee to have a system where you can track what oil and gas and chemical lobbyists are doing is in the public interest, and people don't want to pay $50, and they don't want to have to fill out forms, and they don't want the dread of what do I have to do when I fill out the forms wrong. And I've filled out those forms wrong, and I absolutely get it, but I don't want to give people the illusion that the issue here is just we have to sufficiently expose what the chemical and fossil fuel lobbyists are doing. We also have to sufficiently motivate and share this story with the hundreds and hundreds of nonprofits who would be affected by this, and demonstrate that it's in the public interest, that it's in everyone's interest to better expose and track and hold accountable interests like the Kochs who are undermining climate and civil society.
With that, I'm not seeing any new questions. So perhaps, James, you could give us the closing next steps and how people can get connected with us.
Thanks, Aidan. Thank you so much. I see people on the call whose work has inspired what we've done in Oregon. I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for being here. Aidan mentioned that we are working on getting a reform bill introduced next year, and we're eager to work with more groups in that, so please reach out to Aidan about that. Jasmine also mentioned in the chat a network we've created of parents working on PFAS issues, and the Portland Public Schools have come up a couple of times. And so I just want to leave people with that call to action, which is, I mean, just think about this example. And I am a proud product of the Portland Public Schools. Long ago, you know, your kids go to that school, you're paying taxes. That tax money is then being spent by the school on a lobbying firm that works for Elon Musk as DOGE and Trump undermine public education. And that firm also works for the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers, which helped block the PFAS bill this year. So those tax dollars from Portland public school parents are going to a firm that is exposing their kids and all of us to these further harms from forever chemicals, fossil fuels, you name it. So I have talked to the schools about this issue. I talked to them a couple of years ago about the fact that their firm was working for Northwest Natural and they didn't know it, and they were horrified, and they appreciated the outreach, and that relationship no longer exists. They no longer share a firm with Northwest Natural. And I think that if enough folks on this call and elsewhere reach out to them and say, please, like, stand up for our communities, do not work with this lobbying firm that is blocking protections on PFAS, do not work with this lobbying firm that's working for Elon Musk, that they would act on that, and that would set a really important precedent both for Oregon and for other public school systems that are in the same position. So with that, I just want to say thank you again to Mason and Jennifer for their wonderful work and their enlightening presentations today. We are really excited about the potential for combining these different strands of work in Oregon, and please reach out to us to get involved, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you all so much, and please don't hesitate to get in touch with us again, including to access this recording or partner with us.
Thanks to F-.